During COVID, I produced 2 short videos with Mike Rowe, host of the TV show Dirty Jobs. But Rowe had more to say about things like the nature of work and the push to forgive student loans.
No more debt for you and me!
Here's our full half-hour interview, starting with that demand for student loan forgiveness.
A funny word, forgiveness, back to the Bible. Sure, I'll forgive them, but why do I have to pay them back? I mean, we all make mistakes.
They're in trouble, he says.
They're having to make choices between paying their student loan and paying the rent.
I know guys who worked hard to get a construction operation up and running. And those guys right now are struggling like everybody else. And some of those guys have $40,000 and $50,000 automobiles that they had to finance in order to make their business work. They had to take out a loan on a big old diesel truck. Now, why shouldn't we take care of the loan on that truck if we're going to take care of a loan for a degree? Both are tools that we tell the individual they should go ahead and invest in order to make a go of their chosen vocation. But why would we forgive the cost of a degree and not the cost of a lease payment if the tool in question is equally vital to the job at hand? It just makes no sense. The reason, of course, is because we've got our big, thick thumb on the scale. And for some reason, we think a tool that looks like a diploma is more laudable, more aspirational, somehow more important than that big piece of metal out in the driveway that allows the guy in my example to not only keep his family fed, but to build the homes that you and I are sitting in right now. It's a value judgment on the one hand. It's not about forgiving anything. And there's also the moral argument. I'm sorry, I get it. Everybody who's behind the 8 ball is struggling right now in some way, shape, or form. But many millions of people sacrificed a lot to pay off their college loans. If you're going to pay off these but not them, then persuade me. If you're going to argue that way, Mr. President, I'm curious to know, how is college ever going to become more affordable if we simply pay off the debts? I mean, the cost of a 4-year degree has increased faster over the last 30 years than any other valuable thing in the history of our country. Faster than food, faster than energy, faster than real estate, faster even than healthcare. The cost of a 4-year degree has risen exponentially. And I think part of the reason that's happened is because we've put such pressure on kids to borrow such vast amounts. And when you do that, it just seems obvious that the universities would be able to charge as much as they want. And not necessarily for an education. Maybe it's for a stadium, or maybe it's for a better student union or a better restaurant. I don't know. I just know that if that cost is ultimately going to be borne by people who didn't send their kids there or who didn't attend themselves, something's fundamentally unfair.
And you said, why would that be? Why would you forgive the college loan but not the loan of the guy running the construction business? I imagine it's because the guys who go to college talk better. They participate in the public debate. The people who run the construction business are less likely to do that. And we have the bites on TV. They're articulate. A single mother who owes $200,000 in student loans.
I am here to fight, no matter how long it takes, for full debt cancellation and an education system that treats us with dignity and as equals. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am seeking justice. The only justice is full debt cancellation.
When people say it that way, it's persuasive.
Is it? It struck me as kind of self-involved, kind of myopic. Like, if that's persuasive, why stop with forgiving my debts? Why not start sending me money beyond that? I mean, I don't I just don't know how the argument goes. Look, I get it. There's the snowflake culture, right? And we read about it all of the time. And the millennials and the snowflakes, they're a fun and easy target with their safe spaces and all of these other things that have led to a whole series of expectations that ultimately result in a woman like that saying a thing like that. That kind of expectation, that kind of entitlement is an extraordinary shift from where we were 40 or 50 years ago. But where the snowflakes come from, you know, we're the clouds from which the snowflakes fell. And part of this blows back on us, boomer, right?
Why? What did we do?
We watched it. We watched it happen. We let shop class be slowly arbitraged out of high schools. We let the myths and misperceptions and stigmas and stereotypes that make people sneer at careers in heating, air conditioning, plumbing, and electric. We let that happen. I'm old enough to remember in 1978, the push for college was extraordinary. We needed back in the 60s and 70s, we needed more people going into higher education. We needed more advanced degrees. College needed a push, and it got one. Unfortunately, the push for college came at the expense of every other form of education. And so we wound up trying to make a more persuasive case for a university experience by telling people if they didn't do that, they'd wind up turning a wrench for the rest of their life for some other godforsaken vocational consolation prize. It wasn't long after that before shop class was taken out of high school. And of course, we didn't just take it out overnight. The first thing we did was look at the vocational arts, which is what we used to call it, and we took the art out of it. And that just left vocation, which isn't terribly sexy. And then we knocked vocation down to votech, and then votech became some acronym, and then it turned into shop. And then we walked it out back behind the barn and shot it. That's how we got shop class out of high school. And ever since, we have denied millions of kids an opportunity to just see, to optically experience what work looks like, what half the workforce actually looks like. That's where the stigmas and the stereotypes and the myths and the misperceptions began to take hold, where all of these jobs became stuff that other people's kids did. And once we lost the enthusiasm for that kind of work, everything else, not to oversimplify it, but most everything else followed suit. You've got $1.7 trillion in student loans, and you've got a skills gap of over 7 million good jobs that don't require a 4-year degree. And you got a government that's still lending money we don't have to kids who are never going to be able to pay it back to train them for jobs that don't really exist anymore. We got to get away from that tautology, I think, before we just start writing checks.
For more of my content, go to johnstossel.com. I post a new short video every Tuesday. That's at johnstossel.com. You talk about a skills gap, and many companies say there is one. Also, businesses say they can't find people to work, and they'll train them. The help wanted ads are full. Nobody applies for work in restaurants, say.
The first obstacles we run into when we try and shrink the skills gap vis-a-vis will and enthusiasm, we run into stigmas and stereotypes and myths and misperceptions, and a long list of ideas and notions that keep kids, in many cases, from exploring opportunities that don't require a 4-year degree. We have to confront those things. We have to make a more persuasive case for the 6-figure welder, which is not a myth. He and she, they're real. We've trained nearly 1,200 of them through my foundation. We've got to get them out there as better examples of what can happen to a person who takes the time to learn a skill that's in demand. And then, forgive me, I know it sounds like old school Horatio Alger stuff, but applies themselves. There are millions of instances where the mastery of a skill has led to something that looks an awful lot like prosperity. And we have to do a better job of telling those stories, in my view. We also have to be mindful that when we talk about a skills gap today, what immediately happens is my buddies on the right look at that and say, well, the problem is you got a lazy gene in the species, and you got people who simply don't want to take the time to master the skill. My buddies on the left will say, well, there is no such thing as a skills gap. All the greedy, rapacious employers need to do is write a bigger check, and the supply and the demand will sort itself out. Both of these things miss the point if you look at it through the lens of will as well as skill. There's a larger problem that's keeping people out of these jobs, and it has nothing to do with money. My foundation is giving away $1 million to people who want to learn a skill or master a trade. Does that sound like you?
What does it cost you to train that welder?
Not much. A welding certificate, depending on where you get it, can be a few thousand, up to $8,000 or $9,000. More expensive if you want to work on big machinery. My foundation isn't there to write a blank check. We offer work ethic scholarships because, to my knowledge, nobody else does. There are lots of scholarships for academic achievement or athletic achievement or artistic achievement. We wanted to do something that looked like the Dirty Jobs program I worked on for years. And we wanted to, find a kid who was willing to show up early, stay late, make a persuasive case for himself, and so forth, or herself. Of the 1,200 or so people we've helped, that's about maybe $5-6 million we've awarded over the years. But very rarely has anybody gotten a full ride. I look for people who already have some skin in the game, who are maybe halfway through their process and have run into a struggle. And I want people that I can follow up with, John. This is the thing, for the first 5-6 years that I did this, I didn't have any, I didn't have any evidence other than the anecdotal evidence I saw on Dirty Jobs and in my own life. But now that I can circle back, 13 years into this thing and find somebody who got a welding certificate, and some of those people now are making 6 figures welding in a nuclear power plant, but others picked up a plumbing certification and went on to get a heating and air conditioning thing, followed by an electrical contracting certification. And now they've got 4 or 5 vans and they employ 8 or 9 people. They've got mechanical contracting businesses. This happens all the time. And nobody really, in my view, has made a great case for the path that you take when you're in the skilled trades that so often leads to a small business and a thriving one at that.
It sounds great just becoming the welder. A couple $1,000s of training can bring you close to a $100,000 a year job.
Think about your own career in broadcasting. It's not too dissimilar from mine. When we went to college, I got a 4-year degree, liberal arts education, served me well, cost me about $8,000. Today, the same thing is about 90. But I approached my business, and I don't know you, but from what I've seen of you, it seems like you did the same thing. You're a jobber, you're a tradesman, and your toolbox might be different than that of a welder or a plumber, but we do what we do in this world, and we became proficient at very specific things. And then we embraced a kind of gig economy, a kind of freelance economy that nowadays is kind of taboo. I'm not sure why, but the approach to work, the blue collar trades don't have a corner on that kind of headspace. And it's a very valuable headspace, the freelancing space, the willingness to go to where the work is something else my foundation always looks for. Because it's not just a case now where the expectations of many college graduates involve getting the job of their dreams. They want the job of their dreams many times in the zip code where they happen to be living.
People used to move to where the jobs are. They're more reluctant to do that now.
Are you willing to move? Can you go to where the opportunities are? It's a real stumbling block, and I don't make light of it. Everybody I know who's really truly prospered in the trades has moved a couple of times. But if you can't pivot in your chosen field, then I'm afraid the math is pretty self-evident. You're going to have to hit the reset button. You're going to have to start over. But hey, you're going to have a hell of a story in 5 or 10 years. If you can't work in your chosen field, then you need to think about the reset button. You need to think about maybe not starting over, but at least clearing the slate. You have to be open to it. Investigate it now. See what's out there. Welding really is a thing. I know a lot of six-figure welders. Maybe that's not for you. Maybe it's heating, air conditioning, electric. There's so many areas in the construction trades. People are going to be craving you if you take the steps now to get prepared for that. I hate to sound like somebody's angry neighbor out on the porch, but what the hell, man? I mean, how do we get to California in the first place? How do we get across the country? The whole notion of spending your 20s and maybe into your 30s of going to where the opportunity is and following those opportunities as opposed to simply following your passion or your dream. That's a teachable thing. And we don't teach it the way we used to. But to me, the scariest divide in the country right now is between the people who are convinced that opportunity exists and those who are convinced that it doesn't. That has to change. And so that's what I'm focused on right now, just making a more persuasive case for the overall existence of millions of good jobs that for whatever reason have been largely ignored for the last 40 years. I just talked to a guy the other day, 29 years old, went through our program back about 8 years ago, no debt, 180,000 a year, working on big equipment up on the high plains in North Dakota. Second kid's on the way, bought an F-250 in cash. This kid ought to be on a billboard as an example of what you can do without taking 80 grand of college debt and spending the first 20 years of your career digging out of it.
People saying everybody should go to college. And Michelle Obama did a rap video where one line is,
If you want to watch pain, don't go to college. But for everything else, you should go to college.
This is the cookie cutter advice I'm talking about. Never in the history of the world has a politician dispensed a single bit of advice that applied equally to everybody who was listening. Now, I don't blame her on the one hand. Politicians, they can address the needs of the individual. They have to connect with the fat part of the bat, right? They have to say the thing that they think is going to resonate with the most people. So maybe she truly believes that most people really should go to college. Now, to say that everybody should go to college, she doesn't know who's listening to that. She has no idea. I know that there are millions of people who should not go to college simply because they could. And whenever I say that, the pushback is intense because it sounds like an anti-education thing to say, but it's not. I'm not anti-education. My foundation, we're very, very clear. If you don't have an education, you have no hope. But the idea that the best path for the most people is somehow the most expensive path? Well, come on, follow the money. That's just crazy. How can the best path for the most people be the most expensive path? Or look at it another way. And let's assume she could flick her fingers and everybody did go to college. They borrowed whatever it took. They signed on the dotted line. And now everybody is armed with a degree. What in the world is special about that? What kind of world is that where everybody dreams of being in the corner office, but nobody knows how to build the corner office? Our workforce works when it's balanced. And I don't know how many lawyers we need, how many accountants, how many welders, but I do know that we need a smattering of all of it. And the idea that the kid I described earlier, who's making 180 grand a year, loving life, 2 kids, no debt, that guy went straight from high school, straight through a certification program and to work. And he's balanced and he's smart and he's happy. And he also has something that you and I didn't have when we were in school. He's got this thing, right? He has access to 98% of all the known information in the world at his fingertips. I sat here 2 weeks ago and watched a lecture at MIT on my laptop for free. It was great, for free. I'm not comparing the college experience to sitting in my office watching lectures, but I am a little because the content's basically the same. And if you have a curious mind and a welding certificate, well, there's no reason in the world not to assume you're not going to be educated and balanced and engaged in all things. I will send you a video of Chloe Hudson. I just did a graduation speech for all trade schools because they all invited me and I couldn't get to all of them. So I sat here and I did one. Chloe went through our foundation 3 or 4 years ago. She wanted to be a plastic surgeon. She crunched the numbers and was looking at a $400,000 debt by the time the dust settled. And she got cold feet at the last minute and decided, I'm going to weld. I'm going to learn to weld. She learned to weld. 4 years later now, she's up in New England somewhere. Same basic story, $130,000 a year, no debt, loves it.
For more of my content, go to johnstossel.com. I post a new short video every Tuesday. That's at johnstossel.com. Politicians talk about work like it's something you have to do, but it's more than a paycheck.
We've gone down a very slippery rhetorical road over the last 10 months. And we've talked a lot about education and what happens when you deem some forms of education higher, right? In a de facto way, everything else becomes lower or alternative. The same thing's happened here. And it's difficult for me to articulate this because Dirty Jobs was the granddaddy of essential working shows.
My name's Mike Rowe, and this is my job.
And so everybody's been calling me for the last 10 months to weigh in on essential work. And my message has surprised a lot of people because I think that the dignity you're talking about is not limited to essentiality, if that's a word. We all need to feel that we move the needle in our chosen field. I don't care if you're a bartender or a trampoline maker, doesn't matter. You need to feel connected to your work and to yourself. And that's what's been sucked out of the workforce. We just accidentally and rhetorically called 40 million people non-essential. And then we proved it. We shut them down. We told them to sit quietly and wait for the all clear. And that's hollowed out the dignity. It's hollowed out the will. It's hollowed out the essence of millions of people. We have to be careful with our phraseology. It's not just, as we said from the beginning, it's not just about the money. Our identities are wrapped up in our work. Call somebody's work non-essential, you might as well call them the same.
You've been critical of some of the shutdowns. Now COVID is diminishing.
I wrote a lot about what happens when a safety first mentality is taken literally. And this is something I could talk about for hours, but on Dirty Jobs, we had an expression that we used to say safety third. It was our way of reminding each other to be careful, but it was also a way to remind ourselves that the unintended consequence of a safety first culture, especially on the job, will oftentimes lead to complacency. When somebody else tells you over and over and over, again and again and again, that they care more about your well-being than you do, then you eventually take your eye off the ball. And this happened to my crew and I on Dirty Jobs. You know, we shot 300 episodes, and after the first 100, we had sat through dozens of mandatory safety meetings. And the first couple seasons were interesting. Nobody got hurt, but by season 3, everything went wrong. Broken fingers, nothing serious, thankfully, but concussions and stitches and sprains and contusions. And I singed my eyelashes off in a blast furnace one day. And so we started saying safety third. In fact, here, you'll laugh at this, I actually put it on a face mask, one of these gaiters, and we've been selling these. Don't worry, I'm not going to turn this into a commercial, but for years, you know, safety third was a thing we said on Dirty Jobs, and now all of a sudden it struck me as the embodiment of what was going on in the early days of COVID, when people were desperate to be in compliance, but not necessarily out of danger. So I thought putting safety third on a piece of cloth that would allow me to walk into a bank or a grocery store or just go about my life. Obviously, it's not going to keep germs out, but it didn't matter because somewhere along the line, the masks were doing something else. So yeah, that's a long way of saying I shut down for a couple of weeks, take safety first as a thing for a couple of weeks, and then take the temperature, figure out what's going on. But you can't sustain that forever. And if you try, back to the unintended consequences of shutting down an economy and deeming certain workers essential while others aren't. You can't just call somebody essential without implicitly suggesting that half the workforce is non-essential by definition.
And why the heck are you essential?
I'm not.
But you got labeled as essential along with doctors and firemen.
I live in California, so I don't have an easy answer for any of it. Podcasting was deemed essential. What you and I are doing right now has been deemed essential. I'm not going to argue that it's not essential.
I'll argue that. We're not essential.
Well, all right. Well, then how about this? Isn't everybody essential to someone, if even just themselves?
But it happened in California that way because Hollywood had lobbyists and they got a special break for them.
You saw the woman at the Pineapple Grill, right? She built an outdoor dining area and they shut her down, and the next day, right there, right next to her, hundreds of people on a TV or a movie set were sitting cheek to jowl. Look, the real answer to your question, from my perspective, is not the obvious damage that happens to somebody's personal economy when you tell them they can't work. It's the less obvious fallout that happens to people when you forbid them from doing the thing that defines them. Our identity is so wrapped up in our work. And so it's not just a financial problem that the lockdowns represent. It's a hollowing out of who we are. And you see that happening in virtually every vocation to some degree. It's happening with our schools, keeping the schools closed for this long. But the big thing that I think is happening on top of all of it is it's the hypocrisy of it. That business with Gavin Newsom up at the French Laundry, that's not a small thing. And when the government is asking people to go to extraordinary lengths and trust them just on the basis of their words and their goodwill, and then we see just so many examples of rules for me, but not for thee, or is it the other way around? Whatever it is, people will forgive ignorance, we'll forgive stupidity in our leaders, but it's really hard. It's really hard to forgive hypocrisy when it's that unapologetic and rank.
Just on the subject of safety third, across the country from you, my governor says, if everything we do saves just one life, I'll be happy.
His exact quote, and I remember this, John, because it literally, it was the thing that drove me to the computer to drag the whole safety third manifesto back into the lockdowns. He said, no measure, no matter how draconian, can be deemed ill-advised if it saves but a single life. And I thought, come on. If that was really the goal, well, let's knock the speed limit down to 10 miles an hour. Let's make cars out of rubber. Let's make everybody wear a helmet, and let's eliminate left turns. There, 40,000 lives saved like that. It's easy. It's easy. I can save millions of lives, just if I were king of the world and I had a pen and you had to do what I tell you, saving lives is easy.
What's wrong with that logic?
Because the goal of living is not to merely stay alive. Cars are a lot safer in the driveway. Ships are a lot safer when they don't leave harbor. And people are a lot safer during a pandemic when they sit quietly in their basements waiting for the all clear. But that's not why cars, ships, and people are on the planet. We're challenged now to figure out how to live in a dangerous world. But guess what? That's always been the case. There's a terrific essay by C.S. Lewis called Living in the Atomic Age. Somebody asked him in 1948, how are we supposed to live in a world with atomic weapons when everything could be over like that? And he said, among other things, the same way we lived in a world when the Viking could land on the shore 1,000 years ago and rape all your women and hack everybody to bits. It's no different. It's a dangerous world. And this is a new thing. But he said, let's not fool ourselves by the mystery of the newness. It's not novel. It's just different. And it's one more thing. And we'd be well advised to understand where the risks are. And then we'd be better advised to go about the business of living the only life we have, cautiously, but not in fear, nor in complacency.
And I don't think we know that people are safer staying at home. Domestic violence is up.
We don't know what's going to happen to a kid in the 2nd or 3rd grade, suddenly robbed of 10 months of socialization. We just don't know. But we're going to find out. And when we do, some geek, some nerd with a bigger brain than mine is going to look back, and we're going to assign a cost to safety. And it's going to be high.
A TV anchor who was condemning people who protested against strict COVID restrictions.
You're slapping the faces of the people who are the healthcare workers who put their lives on the line every day because you want a haircut, you want to go play golf.
Probably plays well, if the election's the next day and you're out there and you can prove that you care more about my well-being than the other guy, well, that's a point in your column. But back to my point, do you really want to argue with me that you care more about my well-being than I do?
Well, no, he says he cares about other people's well-being because you might give somebody else COVID.
Right. And I might fall asleep on the road and cross the yellow line, and something bad might happen there as well. There's a whole long list of things. They're all called accidents, right? And I'm not minimizing it. I'm not trying to sweep it under the rug. This thing is real. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous as hell. But whenever somebody starts telling you that your safety is their responsibility, they're either selling you something, running for office, or just yanking your chain. It's not for anyone else to do that, especially with the amount of certainty that we've heard. And again, not to sound all tinfoil capped about it, but certainty is an amazing thing, John. And I was just saying to a friend the other day, whatever it is you think of Dr. Fauci, forget the politics of it. Go back and play the tape when he talks about how masks really are no big deal and don't work. And then look at more recent video of him saying the exact opposite. He sounds the same. He sounds certain. Everybody sounds so incredibly certain. And I write about this a lot because I'm a narrator. I don't know much, but I get paid to narrate stories about the universe and dinosaurs and all kinds of interesting things for all kinds of interesting nonfiction channels. I get paid to sound certain, and I don't know my ass from a hot rock. And I'm no different in that regard than a journalist or a politician or a scientist or a doctor. All of us have the capacity to sound incredibly certain, but certainty and accuracy are not the same thing. So I'm just hyper wary of certainty and earnestness and experts. If we've learned anything from this thing, it's that the initials after your name don't necessarily make you a genius.
Thanks for listening. New episodes drop the first and third Mondays of every month. You can subscribe everywhere you get podcasts.